All right. So, first confession to all of my connections within the execution excellence world. I fell off the path on this one, folks. I somehow didn't recognize the project in all of its depths at the beginning. In short, as I'm about to show you, I had several times in the course of this project allowed Mr. Ask You Me to advise me, and each and every time I did so, the results were as they always are when we give in to the Mr. Ask You Me. So, that being said, where do we start? Let's start with the land. You know, this project begins because I have had a piece of commercial land that I've had for many years, and it wasn't doing anything for us, and it wasn't moving as a sellable commodity either. So that's where I started, and perhaps that's where you're sitting. You've got your piece of commercial land. So what's the first thing you need to know? Well, so the first thing we need to know about commercial land is just saying it's commercial doesn't say the whole thing. So there'll be a commercial level 1, there'll be commercial level 2, there'll be commercial level 3, at least that many. Bigger cities might have even more. Here's where I really got off the rails myself. So I had this in my head that when I read the list for commercial 1, C1, and it had, you know, say a dozen different types of businesses that could be developed in there, including the professional office category that I was interested in. And I went and assumed, my land, by the way, was category C2. My assumption was, at Mr. Ask You Me, I just do not like that guy. Anyway, in my head, it was that the C2 would include everything that was on the C1 list plus the things on the C2 list. So right off the bat, that is not how this works. So let me tell you. You can build in a C1 lot everything it says on the C1 list. Anything else, you better go talk to town council about and make sure. You can build on the C2 list anything that the C2 list says. Each list is independent. Why I thought that they grew one upon another is beyond me, but I'm assuming other people might think that, so I'm mentioning it. So then, the next thing to understand is that most towns, most town councils, they have a lot of interest in developing the commercial lots. And if you find yourself having a C2 lot and a C1 application that you want to develop, that's not the end of the world. Almost certainly your town council will work with you. What you need to know about this piece is 3 readings. 3 readings. What that means is in order for there to be a change in civics, it will have to go through 3 readings at regular scheduled town council meetings. This is so that people will know when and where to come if they wanted to object or interject in any way on the change that you're asking for or proposing. Regular scheduled meetings for most towns will be either monthly or biweekly. So let's call it monthly, and let's understand that what I just said there. Nobody has any interest in stopping you from doing what you're doing, and nobody is working against what you're doing. But if it takes 3 months to get your category change, that is exactly what would be expected. Now, in our case, we got lucky because we're in a very small town. I don't know if this would work in larger centers, but because we're in a very small town, the town council was willing to do the first 2 readings at a single meeting. That cut our timeline by 1/3. That's something that if the town does that for you, you say thank you. So understand that these type of permitting issues and changes that will have to go through council, if it takes 3 months to do it, it's not because anybody is trying to interfere with you. It's not because anybody's trying to stop you. It's just the way civics works. And that's, you know, back at the beginning, I talked about, you know, you can't assume that because you have a lot of residential building experience that you're prepared for everything that's going to come up in a commercial development. Likewise, you can't assume that if you, like me, have 100,000 hours of industrial building experience, that that is going to translate into what you're about to do here. So again, it got me several times. The next place it gets me is in the engineering component. So when you do a commercial building, there's a lot more, the city's going to ask for a lot more engineering reassurances than they are likely going to ask for in terms of in a residential development. So here we are underneath the unit. And to start with, this was originally built as a grade beam style build. So you got these 2 outside grade beams that sat on some kind of support originally, and they sit on steel posts right now. And you've got these engineered floor trusses, you can only see the bottom of them, that are engineered for a 20-foot span. And that's all we had. We had an outside, the 2 outside supporting grade beams and the 20-foot span across to the other side. So now you see, I hope you can see, well, right close to me, there's a 3rd row in here. So this is where you start to get surprises from your experiences, and why you can't assume that anything you know from commercial or industry is going to cross over. Because this building was completely kosher and to code and fine with engineering when it was attached to the original builder's home, because it then fell under residential home building codes. Once I moved it here, it became a purely commercial application. So the very first thing that came up from engineering was you are not allowed to have that 20-foot span anymore. Whether the floor trusses are engineered for it or not, in this type of application, it was deemed not allowed. So we had to put this 3rd beam in the middle. So now our 20-foot span trusses are only on 10-foot span. Then we were just about done, and I don't know if you can really tell, but in the very last minute, we were asked to add another lamination beam to each of these 3. So that's how much difference we're talking about. If we were to code residentially on 2 laminated grade beams, 20 feet apart on the outsides of the building. Then we had to add another lam beam in the center, so now that's 1/3 more. And then just at the final last minute before we got our engineering approval, we had to double up all 3 of these, right? So if you're following along with the arithmetic, for those of you counting at home, we added 1/3 support over what was the residential code, and then we doubled the whole thing on top of that. So that's just the start of why we're underneath here. Now these posts here, those are 9-inch. And they've got 24-inch flanges on the bottom of them. And they are twisted into the ground 27 feet. So if this was a residential building, those would be 5, possibly 7-inch. And they would be down somewhere between 8 and 14 feet. And that's That was how the building sat for most of its life. And now it's been upgraded to commercial standards. So I will say an observation, you always get a chance to do a bit of a study. Ryan at North Hart did a deflection measurement for us because, of course, we all became curious now. We're very familiar ourselves with the grade beam design, and we wanted to know how, you know, if engineering's calling for this center support after 10 years of sitting here, what was the deflection? So I got to say, not disputing the engineering requirements or anything, but in the 10 years this building sat in its original location, we only found 3 millimeters of deflection in the center of this floor. These floor trusses are awesome. I have them in my house. In my house I have 40-foot floor trusses, but they are supported in the center, so that's still, again, 20 feet. So in residential construction, 20-foot floor truss spans are completely normal. But as you can see, that was not allowed to be carried through to the commercial application. So that was the two really big things. Understanding how civics works in terms of, you know, pushing things through town council and the time frames that are involved in that. Yeah, completely caught me by surprise. And the engineering aspects of this job were, you know, you think if you've been in this type of work for as long as I have, you think you have a pretty good idea of, you know, ahead of time of what the engineers are going to tell you on any given question. But it's only going to be relevant to the type of work you're doing. That's my takeaway on this. I wasn't at all prepared for, well, just those foundations. I'm just astounded at the foundations that we've put underneath that building. But it is what it is, and my takeaway and my message to other people is when you do go down the road of doing a commercial development like this, there will be these things that you might not be familiar with if you are not doing commercial developments as your regular gig, so to speak. Really have a sit down with yourself and make sure that you understand that these are just the rules that every developer will have to follow. It might not seem like that when you got money hanging out there and your stress levels are going through the roof, but it is in fact how things actually work. So the main how-to takeaways for me on this were make sure you do understand how zoning requirements work. Make sure that you do understand which building code you're going to be building to. Make sure it's current. Like if there's been a new release, make sure that you have the new release, because they're not going to forgive you for following an old code. If you get caught up, like if you're moving a building like this, you might hear terminology around grandfathering, as we call it. So in my case, there was no grandfathering opportunity because A, the building was originally attached to to a home, like physically attached to a home, so I've made it into a standalone building. Usually the rules for grandfathering involve not making any major alterations. If you take a building that's attached to another building and then make it a standalone building, I'm not going to try to argue that that's not a major alteration. So that was the first step along that way. The other issue with grandfathering for me would have been, although this was a commercial office and it was in fact an accounting office, it was built attached to a residence. So the overriding construction codes that it would have been built to would have been the residential construction codes for the area that it was built in. So again, there is no opportunity for grandfathering here. I'm taking a building out of a residential setting and I'm putting it into a commercial setting. So you need to expect that you're gonna all the way bring it up to the code. So something to keep in mind before you buy a building, right? Like, you know, you have to bring things up one level or move things from residential to commercial or bring it up from 2014 residential to 2018 commercial. That's not that bad. But you start looking at having to bring a building up through several levels of building code, you might not get the economics to work out. So let's talk about the economics a little bit. This all in all said and done, is going to end up costing pretty close to 2/3 of what it would have cost to build new, moving the building here. So I'm going to call that a success. In some places, some things might have gone a little bit smoother. Moving buildings is really uncommon where I live. It's very common in a lot of North America, but up here, if you see a building moving, it's either a modular or it's a skid shack. And moving a stick-built building like this raised a lot of questions for people, and that's another sort of side thing that you need to be aware of wherever you happen to be doing a development is when you do something that's very unusual from what people are used to, doesn't necessarily mean there's anything wrong with doing it that way. It's just going to create more questions, and it's going to, you know, maybe generate another engineering report or two. So be aware of that. All in all, the project went well for us. We're pretty happy, and I think that, you know, once I've had a few days to let the anxiety fade, I couldn't really say I would never do it again. I might even. Have a nice day. Thanks for spending time with me.